Alright, and now for something completely different, let's make a space scene and learn about displacement and a bunch of other settings along the way. So let's start out with this Octane planetary environment, which is a somewhat new feature. It's really similar to the daylight rig. And then let's fire off our scene and rotate this around so we start to see something. And then let's switch to path tracing, because I always switch to path tracing. And then let's hit the lock button so that we're seeing the full extent of our render. Now let's move the camera down a little bit so we catch the horizon. So at first glance, this feels really similar to the daylight. If we rotate it around, we start to see the sun, and it behaves just like we'd expect. Let's drop in an Octane camera real quick and look through it, and this will just let us rotate around more easily so we can kind of pan upwards. Now looking at this planetary environment, we can come to the daylight tag, and then we can twirl down this field for planetary surface. But before we start adding in textures to these slots, let's come over here to altitude and see what happens if we mess with this parameter. So let's just jump this by a factor of 10 and say 11 centimeters. And actually, let's just add in some more ones here. So we started to see a bit of a change. Let's keep going. Keep going. All right, so now things are looking pretty different. Let's turn on our post-processing so this doesn't appear as some weird little white dot here. And then we'll take our glare power all the way down and our bloom power up a little bit. And we can rotate back down just a bit. So the way this atmosphere is now behaving has changed a lot. And it's almost as if we're up in a plane and this is a much more aerial view than before. If we keep going, now it feels like we're in space. And if we pan down, we're seeing the curvature of the Earth and the Earth's atmosphere. Now let's hit this node button so we can start editing this in the node editor. So I'm going to drop in an image texture here into the star field slot. And then if we bring this over, we can navigate to the texture that we need. Now just so you can find this yourself on Google, if we type in Milky Way, and then come to images, and then we can choose large. It used to be much easier to use Google, and we could actually specify a resolution like 5,000 pixels or above. So weirdly now, an even better place to go is Bing Image Search. And we can come to Bing Image Trending here. And then now we can type in Milky Way. Already it looks like we're getting better results, but I want to come to image size and say at least, let's say 5,000 pixels by 3,000. So this might be a good option. Instead, let's type in star map. And here we go. This image is 8K, and it's hard to see, but you can boost this a lot. Now, before Google decided to actually make its search engine worse, I downloaded a 16K version of this same image. And then on top of that, I went in and made this a seamless texture, which is really easy to do in Photoshop or After Effects by using the offset filter, and then just cloning in detail from other parts of the image. And I also removed a lot of the stretching that was up here at the top and tinted it blue, because this is useful for Octane because you can decide whether you want to desaturate it or shift the hue and use the color that's embedded. Just makes it a little bit easier to use right off the bat. So we're going to supply you with this image to download so you can kind of skip these steps rather than having to make it seamless yourself. So I'll come in here and grab that same star map. And there we go. I can also hit UV transform here to scale it down. And let's move this light below the horizon so we can see the star map better. So it looks like I scaled it down too much because we're seeing the repetitions. And we can also rotate it, but then it starts to break up and cause this line in the middle. So that's no good. So to fix this, we can come here to projection. And I'll give myself a bit more room. And currently it's using mesh UV, so let's switch this to something like spherical. And there we go, that's a much nicer look. So now we can scale this down, and we're not going to see any seams here even if there's a lot of texture repetitions because I made it seamless. So somewhere around there is pretty good. And then we can also drop in a color correction here and maybe take the hue a little bit more towards blue. rather than green. We could also desaturate somewhat. And if we want this to be less subtle, we could boost the power to 2. And we could also play with the gamma. One look you could create is a pretty crunched down look where you really only see the brightest stars. So say we took this up to 5 or 6, then we get really bright stars and less of that cloudy detail here. But I personally prefer to keep it closer to 1 and then not crunch the gamma so hard and just have it be a bit more subtle back there. So let's come back to a lower altitude. Let's kind of delete a couple of these ones here and then move our environment around and then pan upwards. So when we're this low, we can create a really cool time-lapse effect. Say the sun's up here in the sky, and we just keyframe this downward, and when the sun dips way below the horizon, the stars begin to come out. And maybe now, because we're less in space, we should boost the power of this a little bit. So let's just take this up to something like 10. Now we're seeing a bunch of stars. And then let's also transform this upwards on Y so that we're getting that Milky Way detail. So again, if we rotate this upward, we just get a nice blue sky, and then as we bring it downward, we get a sunset, and then we start to see the stars. So that's kind of a useful feature. Let's undo back until we were at a much higher altitude here. And then let's see what happens if we keep increasing this number. And then let's pan downwards. There we go, now we're seeing the curvature of the Earth even more. Let's keep going, add another 1, and then pan downwards further. And there's our planet. And let's make this even smaller. Let's say take this up to 5. And now as we move this environment around, we can see the different effects we'll get. But let's stick here for the time being. Now we're getting this weird haloing effect of the Milky Way galaxy because we're pointed downwards. When we were pointed upwards, it was no issue, but you can see the closer you get to the pole of the sphere, the more things get kind of crunched in. So we should be able to fix this by changing the projection yet again. Let's try box. And that looks like we're getting somewhere. So let's scale this up a bit and then rotate it on Y. And then we can kind of shift this along in the X transform and scale it up further. And maybe even unlock this aspect ratio, which then stretches it out a bit. Maybe that's too much, so let's go like 1.5. And then we can also bring up the power on this so we can see it a bit better. Maybe 3. And let's pan downwards a bit. Now we're catching this twice, so again, we need to scale this up a bit more. That's looking pretty good to me. And by the way, you can pan this image around by middle clicking and dragging when it's in this locked mode. So next, let's start texturing our planet here. Now let's just texture it like it's the Earth to start. If you come to Video Copilot and then go to Ultra Earth 3D, obviously you can create some really cool looking planets in Orb, but we're doing this in Octane because we want to be in this full 3D environment. So let's download these Earth textures here. And now I would suggest just using the node editor, but again, this is a really new feature when it comes to HDRIs and lights, so it's not quite all fleshed out yet. And if you see, there's a ground albedo here, but we don't have that same parameter here. So we're gonna have to go through the layer system on this one. So let's go here and come down to plugins, C4D Octane, and then image texture. And it showed up here in the node editor, but it says it's not connected to anything, even though it is. So now we wanna jump into this albedo. And again, albedo is just another word for diffuse, though technically an albedo map doesn't have any shadow information baked in, where diffuse maps often do. So let's come over here, and I'm going to navigate to my Earth Textures folder, and then I'll come to Earth Diffuse and use that. Let's hit the UV Transform button, and then let's go back to Get Active Tag Object. And now, even though this isn't linked, we can now control it. So I could transform this around, or rotate it. Let's rotate it 180. And now let's duplicate this texture here and drop in a normal map and connect it up to our normal slot. Now this isn't going to work unless we use the same transform as we did before. And let's hold 2 and right click so we can zoom in and see what that's doing. So I'll go compare store, and then I'll disconnect the normal map. And you can see it's making a bit of a change here. It's really subtle and it's not doing that much, but it's something. Let's reconnect this, and then we'll make some room and duplicate this again. And remember to use the same transform node so that they're all oriented the same way. And here we can use the glossiness map and plug that in. And now let's zoom back out. So we've got our maps in here. It can also use an elevation or displacement map or an emission map. We could plug in the emission map for fun. Let's put the same transform in here and then grab the earth illumination. This one should actually make a visible difference. There we go. We can see these earth lights down here. And at this point we can call this pretty good, but it's not great. I just wanted to show you how far we could get with this, and it is useful for things like that time lapse, or if you're closer to the Earth's atmosphere, to get those really nice gradient colors. But here as a planet, I'm not finding it as useful. So I'm just going to delete this and we're going to start fresh. Alright, so instead of the planetary environment, let's drop in an HDRI environment. And then let's jump into this image texture and hit these dots. And then I'm going to navigate back to where I had my star map. There we go. And then I'll reset my camera as well. I'm also going to go for a wider aspect ratio, so let's switch this over to Octane, and then I'm going to do 1920 by 800. Now this comes in flatter, but again we can just jump in here into our image texture, hit UV transform, twirl this down, and then scale this down. And also come up here and play with the gamma. And by default, the mapping type on this is nice. Let's select this tag and then go to our node editor again. And with this window too, middle click will allow you to pan around. So let's add in a color correction here so that we can do what we did before, which is desaturate and shift the hue a little bit towards blue. Next, let's build our Earth from scratch. Let's just drop in a sphere and move this back on the Z-axis. We could actually push this way far back into the scene and then scale it up a ton, so that if we're moving the camera, it'll appear to be a really big object far back in the scene. Now let's up the segments to something like 250, and that smooths it out. And now let's jump over to materials and create a new diffuse material for starters, and we'll drop that on the sphere. Now we could use a daylight to light this, and then just select mix sky texture, and then we could rotate this around with a coordinate here. But an easier way is if we just push this back on Z as well. There we go. Now we can actually see the daylight. So let's rotate this around. And this is pretty good, but the issue is that when it gets to the horizon, it goes dark. So we don't really want the daylight here. We want more of an infinite light type setup. So instead what we can do, delete that. We can just drop in an area light. And again, let's move this back on Z. There we go. And actually, let's put it in the sphere's position. So let's drop it under the sphere and hit reset PSR. And then we'll scoot it this way and rotate it towards the planet. There we go. And now if we just drop in a null object underneath the sphere and again reset PSR, then we can use that to control the light. So first off, we can scale it up so it's way far away. And we want the light to be really small because we want hard shadows as if it's an infinite light or daylight. Then we can boost up the power on this light a ton, maybe make it a little bit warmer. And now we can use this to rotate the light around, almost like a daylight rig. So we'll just call this our sunlight. And now in this material, let's jump into the node editor. And let's get our image texture here and pop it into the diffuse. Now I'll navigate back to my earth textures and choose earth diffuse. And that's a start. Now let's grab the roughness map. And here it says glossiness. So let's pop that in there. Now glossiness maps are actually the inverse of roughness maps. So when we plug this in, we're actually going to want to hit this invert button and then it'll be correct. Now we're not going to see any highlights until we actually turn this into a glossy material. So there we go. Now let's add the normal map, just control drag to duplicate. And let's pop this in here. Now you can see it's yellow. That's because we have the invert button on, so let's undo that. and then pop that into the normal slot. And now it's hard to see a change, so let's hold down 2 and right click to zoom in. And let's compare store render buffer. And then we'll disconnect this by double clicking. And there you can see that it's adding a bunch of detail. And let's duplicate this texture one more time. And let's grab our illumination map. Now we don't have anywhere we can plug this into until we switch this to a universal material. And now remember, when we switch to universal material, the metallic slider is all the way up, so let's bring that back down, and we'll be right back to where we were. And in the past, we would have had to create a mix texture to do this, but here we can do it all under the universal material. So let's navigate over here to emission and then hit black body emission. And then I'll just pipe this into the texture slot. And you can see we're starting to get those lights there. Now we could boost this a little bit if we want. And the neat thing here is if we were to rotate this, it would behave realistically, where this line is the dividing line between when the lights are on and off. The lights actually do stay on over here, but because they're getting drowned out by the sunlight, you don't see them as much. If I boosted this by a lot, like 1100, then you'd still see some of these lights on. So maybe let's do like 400, and that's kind of a nice in between there. And we could maybe go a little bit warmer with these. Okay, now we want to add some clouds, so let's duplicate this sphere underneath, and let's just scale it up ever so slightly, just that much. Then we'll come back to materials here, duplicate this by holding down Control, and then overwrite this material. Then in this one, make sure to hit Get Active Material so we're altering the right thing. And here we can just delete all of these, including the black body emission, and we'll take this here and just replace the texture with the clouds. So these are going to go into the albedo slot, and then to make them see-through, we're also going to pipe them into the opacity slot. And there we go. Now we've got some clouds, and they even have little shadows going on. We could even duplicate this and swing it around for some additional clouds. But just be careful, if they're the exact same sphere, we get some render errors here. So let's scale this one up ever so slightly. And I can just hold down Alt here and then bump the radius. Control-Shift-Z to undo view so we can get back to where we were. And if you look here, we're getting a bunch of little fireflies. And that's because I haven't changed that thing that we talked about earlier, which is the GI clamp. So if I take this back down to 1 from the default, immediately that cleans up. And just to prove that we're not losing anything, we can go compare store render buffer and then take this back to 1,000,000. Unfortunately with this, you can't just hit undo to go back to the value. And you also can't reset this, which is another really irritating thing. So you have to kind of create a new scene to see what those defaults are. Though you can also come up here to settings reset, but then it'll reset all your settings. So we don't want that. And this is to show you there's no difference in light between GI clamp of 1,000,000 and GI clamp of 1. It just cleans up a lot faster. So in this case, let's go to GI clamp of 1. All right, let's rotate this around a little bit. I think I like that look better. And now the last thing we really need is that halo or atmosphere around the Earth to really sell it. So to do that, let's go back to our main material here. And let's scooch this over so we get a bit more space. Now for the time being, I'm going to unplug this texture for the city lights because we're going to be piping something else into the black body emission node. So let's grab this node called fall off and let's just pipe it into the texture here. And immediately you can see what that's doing. It's basically a Fresnel node that causes the shader to appear on the edges but fall off towards the center. So in this fall off map, we can also change the skew factor, which will collect it even more closer to the edges. There are other modes here too that are really useful, like normal versus vector 90 degrees or 180 degrees. 90 is especially useful for creating certain materials only on the tops of things like rocks, so it's really useful for dust or snow. Let's go back here. And now we can add in a gradient here. Just drop that in. And we can remap this to a light blue. Maybe a little bit more on the blue side than the green side. Keep pushing it this way. And we could also hit surface brightness and then bring it way down. So that's pretty nice, but I want to cut it off here at this diagonal line so it doesn't appear on the shadow side of the earth. So what I'm going to do is pull this back a little bit, and I'm going to add in a multiply node. And just like Photoshop or After Effects, when you multiply two things together, they tend to get darker. So here what we really want is a gradient. So if we take this gradient and pop it in here, and then we can choose linear mode, and then scoot these nodes over here. And then we can right click and solo this to see what it's doing. Let's crunch this down and then bring the white point in. And already we're getting pretty close to what we want. So let's disable this solo. And I'd say the only thing that's bugging me is this hard cutoff here. So let's solo this again. And if we transform this down, you can see that there's a hard cutoff on the other side here. So we can change this sine wave node here from saw wave to sine wave. And now we've got smooth interpolation. And let's take this back to 1. And we could transform this around. And then disable. And still we've got this issue, and it's a little bit hard to solve because it has to do with the UV mapping. And it's on this pole here. So what we could do to cheat it is just take this and rotate it this way. And this is looking a lot nicer. Now we've lost these lights here, so let's combine this with the image we had before. I think I deleted it by accident, so let's come back here to image texture and go and grab our lights here. And let's take this whole setup here and scoot it back. So to combine this, we want to keep the bright parts of the image and lose the dark. And in After Effects or Photoshop, that would be an add blending mode or screen. And if we scroll down here, we've got an add node. So let's drop this in here and then just pipe this right into texture 2. And there we go. That's pretty cool looking. Now I'm seeing an issue here, and we're getting this really sharp highlight from the softbox. That's our daylight. And we weren't seeing this before the clouds. This was looking nice, but after the clouds we're seeing it. So that says to me there's an issue with the cloud texture. So let's jump into the cloud texture and click Get Active Material. And if we look in here, we'll see under roughness that currently it's set to 0. So let's just bring this up a bit and maybe even more. And there we go. That's looking way better. Now as a last little trick, we could emphasize this atmospheric effect. So let's duplicate one of these little cloud spheres, and we'll come down to our main material and duplicate this as well, and then replace the material here. Now in this material, again, Get Active Material, just to make sure we're on the right one, we really only want the Fresnel effect. So let's delete all these. And let's even scale this up a little bit more so it's a little bit bigger than the clouds. And now we don't want these lights, so we can delete the add node as well. And let's bring all these nodes a little bit back together with the black body emission so it's easier to deal with. And again, let's solo this to make sure we're seeing the right thing. This is a little bit oriented up versus to the right, so let's maybe rotate this around if we can. This transform X seems to do the trick. Okay, and here we want to use this same setup as an opacity map. It's a little bit too far away, so let's scale this down a bit. And then the other thing we can do is come over to our fall off map and maybe decrease the skew factor. And if we want to go crazy, we could boost the overall light, but I think that's a little bit too much. And then we could also experiment with this gradient here. And maybe let this one creep a little bit further. So without this, we're looking like this. And then adding it in, we're just beefing that up a little bit more. Now if it's getting too blown out and it's a bit too extreme, we could also come in here and just reduce the amount of light. But I think I'll leave it where it is. And last but not least, if we come to our main texture here, I want to add a bit more saturation to the planet. This isn't necessarily correct, but I kind of like the look of this. So if we drop in a color correction here and just boost the saturation a little bit, we'll get some more color out of the continents and the sea. One other thing that can really make this feel like there's a bit of atmosphere is if we come into our post-processing and just up the bloom somewhat. And then don't forget the cutoff slider, which really lets us bloom out the highest highlights out here. Another pretty cool control here is the spectral intensity and spectral shift. So if we boost this, you can see we're getting some rainbows. And then the shift will just change the colors. That's feeling kind of nice to me. So all this is really cool, but this is just an element in the scene. We're actually here to create the moon's surface. So let's back the camera off quite a bit and position this up in the sky where we want it. And I'm going to bring this down a little bit so we're seeing our full frame. Maybe I'll go to 0.8 and expand this a little bit. And because we've been jumping back and forth between solo modes and path tracing, this has gotten confused as to what kernel we're in. So let's just make sure to set it to path tracing. Okay, now for the moon's surface, I'm going to drop down a plane here. And then I'll just position this under the camera and reset PSR. And then I'll bring this coordinate forward a little bit and down. And there's our plane. Let's bring it forward some more. There we go. And now I'm going to go into our object here and just max out the segments. Because now I'm just going to drop on a displacer, so I'll hold down Shift and come to our displacer object, and then go to shading and add in a basic noise. Now obviously this is extreme, so let's jump into our noise and up the global scale. That could work. So this is the simplest terrain we could possibly make, but we're going to make it look good with Octane's displacement. So let's come to materials, let's drop in a new diffuse material and then place that on the plane. And then let's drop in a light so we can actually see what's going on. So just drop in an area light here and let's make sure it's oriented towards the camera, flip it around 180. And that's obviously working. Let's take the opacity down to 0 and maybe I'll stretch this out. Now we're seeing a bit of an effect but not much. So let's change our texture here, come into our node editor, and now we've got a mess. So again, get active material, and then change this from diffuse to glossy. And then let's take the roughness all the way up. So that's a start. Maybe we position the light a little more over here so that it's almost as if this planet's casting on the surface. And now let's come down to displacement and say add displacement. From here we just need an image texture. And then I'll show you where I got this texture. So if we type in moon displacement and go to images, there it is, though this is a lower resolution one. So again, let's go to Bing image search. And then let's go to image size and say at least 5,000 by 3,000. So that's gotten us some cool images that we could use as displacement maps, but not the one that I'm looking for. Maybe we went a little bit too high, so let's try 2,000 by 2,000. And this looks like it could work, but this is actually a bump map. So this is still not what we want. So back to Google again. When I go to large, this actually comes up. So this one's 5,600. Let's view this image. And there we go. This actually took me to something else really cool, Google Height Map Images. If we click on this, there's a ton of images that are the correct format for displacement maps. So here's a mountain, here's like a river type thing. These could be really cool to mess around with. But coming back here, and obviously you could just go straight to the site. This one's an 8K. And so again, what I've done is I've taken this and removed any of this distortion by creating a seamless image. And I'll provide this for you too here. So let me come over to my favorites here, and I've got this one, and this one's only a 4K image, but it'll work great anyway. So let's double click this, and now we're seeing something totally crazy, and that's because if we jump into displacement, currently our maximum level of detail is 256 by 256. I'm just going to ramp this all the way up to 8K. And now we're starting to see a really complex looking surface. So let's take this height down from 10 to 1. And that's not quite enough, but let's scale this texture down. So if we hit UV transform, we can bring this transform node down. And weirdly, the smaller we make the displacement scale, the more we'll notice these bumps. So if we set this to 0.5, for instance, this is going to look a lot more displaced. So let's set this to like 0.1. And now we're getting somewhere, but the light is not doing us any favors, so let's move this up. And now maybe we need to bring down the height of the displacement, so let's take this down to 0.5. That's definitely letting a little bit more light in, but I think we could just boost this light in general. Let's bring it up and maybe stretch it out even more, and then bring it down closer to the horizon. There's definitely a sweet spot here. And the other thing is, we don't want the specular highlights to be quite so intense. So if we jump over to the specular here, we could just take this down. And then maybe we widen this even more and bring it up a touch. And let's play with taking our displacement back to 1. And this is looking pretty good. I'm going to move my earth here a little bit over so it's more on the third line. One way we could do that is also by coming over here to our composition and turning on stuff like the grid, or even the golden section, or the golden spiral. With the golden spiral, you could mirror it, and maybe we move this just around here. Actually, I'm liking it a little bit better down here, closer to the third line. So I'm going to turn these off. Now this is taking a really long time to resolve, even with my 4 GPU setup. You can see it's going to be about 4 minutes per frame, but that's to get to 16,000 samples, which is a huge number of samples. But one thing we could actually do is come in here and turn on this thing called adaptive sampling. And now this first parameter, noise threshold, is probably the one that will affect things the most. So I'm going to bring this up a bit closer to 0.1. But what this means is the sensitivity of the adaptive sampling to noise. So if our slider is really far down here, and we come to this noise pass, anything that's green is considered noise free. And you can see that it's stuck on this background, even though the background is pretty clean from the very beginning. So that means we've taken it down too far. When I bring it up closer to 0.1 and refresh, we're going to see this go green really quickly, which is what we want. So basically this means Octane's focusing on everything that's not green. And so because it's focusing on less of the image, that means it can plow through the samples a lot faster. This other parameter here, 256, is the number of samples it goes through before adaptive sampling actually kicks in. So that's another one that you may want to raise or lower depending on your scene. Sometimes depending on your scene you may not have even more than 256 samples to begin with, so in that case you would want to lower this value. But you can see now it's really racing through those samples. It's already at 10,000 because it's only dealing with this small patch of stuff that's pretty noisy. And so that sped the final time for our render up to 1 minute and 30 seconds versus before when it was more than 3 minutes. So I think that's super useful. We'll leave that on for now. One other thing we can do to make this seem more dramatic and interesting is we could actually just boost this displacer. Let's try taking it up to a height of 15. And so now we're going to get a lot more curvature and maybe more visual interest to this. Now one other reason this isn't cleaning up quickly is all this stuff is backlit and it's technically a glossy texture, so the small details in here are getting hit by the light at different angles, and that's causing all sorts of really small glossy specular highlights, and those take a while to clean up. So one thing we could do is maybe duplicate this light here and bring it over. Maybe we change the shape, expand it, and then rotate it. So that's definitely another good option for the lighting. I did like it a bit more though when it was moody and backlit like this. Now as far as the texture goes, we can try changing it to diffuse, and that'll definitely clean up faster, though you can see it looks way less interesting this way. We could compensate for that though by really blasting this light. So say we take this up to like 5,000 or even 15,000, and now we're getting some of that visual interest back. And it's cleaning up really fast because we don't have all those little glints from the glossy texture. To me though, this feels a little bit too smooth. The second we switch this back to glossy, things get way more contrasty, though obviously now the light is way overblown. Though another thing we could do is take the specular all the way down And this is still different from the diffuse texture. If you notice here, this is cleaning up really fast, just as fast as the diffuse texture. But if we store this and go back to diffuse, you'll notice that this glossy one has a lot more contrast versus this, which just feels unrealistically soft. So I'm going to pop back to glossy and then maybe give it a little bit of specular, but take our light back down. Now this background feels a little bit like it's at odds with the rest of the image, so let's take this and desaturate it, and then maybe shift it a little bit more towards green. And actually, here's another cool shortcut that we haven't used yet. If you right click in the live viewer, you can actually go select material, and then it'll give you this material here. Though right now it's selected the topmost one, which is the fall off map, which is not exactly what we want. But it's good to know you can do that. You can right click down here and select this, and now we'll get this displacement material. The other thing that's cool is you can right click and say select object, so that'll take us to the plane. And then here, if we right click up here and select object, we'll be fine, we'll get the sphere. But keep in mind that if we select object over the light, this is another quirk of Octane's and something that I'm asking them to fix, but if you try and select object when there's a light there, it'll actually get you the light. So that's not very useful. And the same thing happens when we pick focus, but we'll get into that later when we check out the depth of field settings. Anyway, back to this, we're going to go to our main material here, and then we'll take this gradient and pull this over, and we'll just shift this a little bit more towards blue. And then we'll do the same thing with our other material here. That's just kind of beefing up those atmospherics. Take this and shift it a little more towards blue. Let's jump into our Octane tag here and let's enable the camera imager. And also let's go to post-processing and maybe give it even more bloom. I think that's kind of nice. And just jumping around here, let's come back to the background. And I think I'd like to move this upwards so that our Milky Way is stretching across the sky here. Now jumping back to the camera imager, I definitely think we could benefit from putting a LUT into here. And let's hit these dots, and I'm going to navigate to where I keep all my LUTs. And this is pretty exciting. GSG just released all the Gorilla Grade LUTs onto the Plus platform for free. So you guys can just go ahead and download these, and then come into these raw LUTs here. And I'll start with like cinematic, let's try this. And I'm going to go for these cubes. I'll try out Blockbuster. And you can see this unifies the whole color palette. This might be a little bit too extreme. We could maybe dial down the strength. But that's a pretty cool look right there. Maybe we boost the exposure. And now we're getting a bit too much bloom. So let's come over to the post-processing and just dial this back a bit. And if we want, we could bring in a bit of this highlight compression. Here you can see it clips out less, though I kind of like it clipping out a bit. So maybe we'll just bring this up a touch. Now one other fun thing we can do, this is another new feature in Octane, if we come over here to thin lens and then drop down to universal, we get the new universal camera. And that can do things like this spherical distortion here, or this barrel distortion. So you can get more of a crazy fisheye look here, or you can actually switch to a fisheye lens. And obviously that's way too far out, so let's bring this back. And we don't want to see these black borders, so let's turn off the hard vignette. And this is kind of subtle, but it could be a cool way to introduce some extra distortion and make it feel like your scene was photographed with a real lens. Personally though, I'm going to switch back to thin lens because I liked this composition better. If we want, we could also play with some depth of field. Let's make sure to start by turning off autofocus so we can actually choose where we're going to focus. We could just bring this aperture up a little bit. And already that's way too much, so let's go back down. In our current scale, a little bit goes a long way. And now you should be able to see that we're out of focus here in the foreground. We can also grab this focus picker and pick focus on the foreground. And maybe you've got a character standing here and he's in focus and everything else goes out of focus. I also really enjoy setting this aperture aspect ratio to 2, which stretches out all the bokeh and makes it look like an anamorphic lens. And then I also often take this aperture edge up to 3, which is as high as it goes. And that creates more of a defined rim on these bokeh and then a semi-transparent center. You'll see it a lot better if I boost the sky texture. So say we take this to a brightness of 4, and we could go compare store. I'm going to turn off the focus picker, and then we take this aperture edge back to 1. Now it should be clear how much more defined these get when we set the aperture edge to 3. So I'll take that back to 3. And then we could also focus on somewhere in the midground. And then maybe we take this down really low so it's subtle. Or we could focus all the way on the planet. And this is kind of cool now because only this section here gets out of focus slightly. And that just gives it a bit more of a photographic feel. Though I could go either way. With wide space shots like this, I tend to not have very much shallow depth of field. And also let me take this texture back down to 1 because I like it a bit more subtle. Cool, so this is how our scene is looking fully rendered. I think that's fairly pretty. And this is the one I did earlier when I was figuring out what the heck I was going to teach. One thing I like about this a bit better is this warmth in the light on the earth. So that's something we could mimic pretty easily here. Just by taking this light and giving it a bit more warmth. And maybe also rotating this around until it's affecting the earth a little bit more. So that's kind of a neat look right there too. Okay, so on the topic of displacement, let's drop in a sphere. And we'll bring it close to camera. And scale it down. And give it some more segments. And then let's just kind of fly over to our sphere here. And now we have another edgy Instagram render. Let's bring this light down so it's not blinding us quite so bad. And now if we were to just apply the same moon texture to the sphere, let's actually duplicate this texture so we can alter it. Let's put this on the sphere. And we can tell it's tiling too many times here. So one way to affect the whole texture at once is actually using Cinema 4D's texture system.
So we could scale the whole texture up and down at once using these parameters.
As long as we're in UV mode. So if we double click this and go into our Octane editor and then hit Get Active Material, this texture here that's controlling the displacement doesn't have a projection node. So by default, it's set to UV. If we hit projection, we'll see that it's in UV mode. And currently in the displacement node here, we can see that the type is texture displacement. And texture displacement is this mode in Octane that is kind of magical, that is allowing us to do this displacement really, really fast and create such high resolution detail. Now, if we change this to box or any other mode, it's not actually going to make a difference because texture displacement only works in Octane with the UV mode. And I'll prove this to you real quick here. If we bring up the height, say to 15, and maybe let's also bring up the scale so it's not so crazy. And now I'll store my render buffer here, and then take this from box to cylindrical, for instance. You can see there's no difference. Back to UV. Same deal. Let's scoot this over real quick. And the other gotcha about texture displacement is that it only works with image textures. If I tried to take a noise, for instance, and drop this in here, it wouldn't read it. And by the way, this mid-level is a slider that controls whether the displacement is displacing outwards, inwards, or a little bit of both. So at 0.5, it's a little bit of both, and that whole thing's going to shrink in. And at 1, it's going to shrink in even more. So that can be really helpful depending on what objects are clipping. Like if we had a bunch of rocks scattered here and they were all clipping into the displacement, we could slide this down until it's no longer intersecting. Let's take this back to 0. Now the new mode in Octane, other than texture displacement, is extremely similar to Redshifts displacement. It's vertex displacement. And here this is going to be really weird when it's set to vector. This is for different types of displacement maps that look more like normal maps that are called vector displacement maps. But here we want to change this to a height because currently our image is fully black and white and it's a height map. It can only displace upwards or downwards, whereas vector displacement can displace in all directions. Now the first thing you're going to notice is the resolution got really bad. So unlike texture displacement, vertex displacement actually cares about the underlying geometry. So here we only have 245 segments. If we were to boost this to say 1,000, then we get a much nicer look. But also look here at our used VRAM at 2.8 versus before at 245, we were at 2.6. So this mode ends up using a lot more VRAM. Another option to displace this is to take our subdivision level up here so that we're bypassing cinema for the subdivisions. And this can be a little more efficient. So let's take this up to 2, and there we go. But keep in mind, 2.8, if we bump this up to 3, we're now at 3.3. So it's very easy to quickly crash your scene with this method or use more VRAM than you anticipated. Now on a positive note, this kind of displacement can get you out of some tricky situations, and overall it's more versatile, but it's not as fast or as memory efficient. And here's one major difference. We can now set this to box, and now we're actually seeing a difference in box mapping this displacement. Same thing for if we switch this to spherical. Again, we're mapping this differently, and this might be a more accurate result for this kind of object, since it is spherical. The other thing we can do here is actually use noises, and now we're using this simple noise to create displacement, which is pretty cool too. In Octane 2020, we actually have access to all of C4D's native noises, which is really exciting, and we can use those for layering and displacement as well. Now another new feature I want to quickly cover is this displacement mixer, and this is similar to redshifts. And what we can do is, say we wanted to mix this noise with this texture here, we could create a second displacement map by control dragging this and then plug this in here. And then we could plug this into displacement 1 and this one into displacement 2, and then we could plug this into our overall displacement. And so now if we decrease the blend weight of this first one, we'll be back to just our moon texture. So let's store that render buffer there. And then if we bring this back to 1, we'll be doing a 50% blend between these two textures. You can see how that's changed there. And then if we took this down to 0, we'd be back to just the noise. Now this would be more obvious if we duplicated this texture and used a different displacement map instead. I've got this one lying around, so let's plug this in. And then let's scale this down. Not quite that far. Cool, so this is creating some pretty neat looking mountains and then a river that runs through the center. So if we set this blend weight back to 1 for our moon texture, we'll see that we're getting a crazy combination of the craters with the mountains that we had before. Now this blend weight can also be driven by noises and other textures too. So if we solo this node, we're going to see this just turns to white, which is not very helpful, and Octane's sometimes really picky about soloing. So let's plug this into the diffuse, and then we'll actually see it soloed. And now we can just slam the contrast really high and maybe up the octave so it's a little bit more detailed. And actually maybe less on the omega so we get these more patchy regions like this. And this could define where displacement 1 and displacement 2 happen. So now let's disconnect this from the diffuse, unsolo, and then pipe this into blend weight 1. And there we go, that's now defining where our mountain texture is happening, and I think actually removing it from the black areas. So let's store this render buffer as well and see what happens if we plug this also into blend weight 2. So now it looks like we're getting full displacement of both of these textures in the white areas and no displacement in the black areas. So I think a more interesting result would be if we had one type of displacement in one area and the other type of displacement in the other area. So we could do this by duplicating this and then setting this one to inverted. So we just hit this invert button here. There's also an invert node that you could use. And then let's pipe this into blend weight 2. And there we go. Now we've got moon craters in these regions and mountains in the other regions. Now I don't know if they fixed this in 2020, but in the version I'm in right now, if I switch these back to texture displacement, this displacement mixer is not working. Now lastly, on the subject of displacement, I want to show you a place where the vertex displacement really saved my butt. So this is a scene from some Excision concert visuals that I did recently, and I'm just going to turn off this tornado VDB here because it slows things down a ton. So the displacement object I'm talking about is this ring of rocks. And this began as a simple torus, and then I gave it a bunch of segments and sculpted on it, and I also chopped away this middle section. But that left these caps that were open. So I used this plugin called Quad Caps to fill the holes, but then keep everything as quads. But that created a really big issue with the UVs that I'll show you right now. So if I come up here, you can see I've got two textures going on. And maybe I'll lose this outer frame here so you can see this a bit better. Come down here and turn off the cockpit, and then I'll just back the camera up a bit. And now if I take this texture off here, which is the texture just for this cap, and then I delete the selection from my main displacement texture, now you should be able to see what the issue is. This looks totally messed up. And what's happening is the texture scale here is super small compared to this. So we're getting this almost hairy-like displacement. If I zoom into this, and then delete my keyframe so that Octane actually updates, now you should be able to see just how weird and small scale this displacement is. So the solution was creating two selection tags here and here, one for this displacement and then one for this displacement. And with these caps, when this was set to texture displacement, there was just no way to get this looking good. Even if I scaled this up, it still looks totally messed up. And this cap comes apart from the rest of the geometry, which is a common issue with Octane texture displacement along seams. So here we now have a way to solve this. When we come to vertex displacement, and then I scale this back down, this cap actually blends in. But ultimately, because this seam was so huge, this had to be a little bit lower resolution than the rest. If this were bumped up to 3, it caused my VRAM usage to jump from 6.8 to 7.3 gigs, and that was just too much for the scene, especially with everything else on. I was overdriving my VRAM, and it wouldn't all fit.